Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. So welcome to the 3Grow webinar, Supercharging Your SharePoint Document Management. So as I've just posted within the Q&A, you'll see a note in there just to say that's where you should be posting questions, and we will get to those upon conclusion of the slides and demos and things like that in approximately an hour. Also, just to let you know, the webinar is going to be recorded. This recording will then be made available via the 3Grow YouTube channel. So if you want to revisit it, or if any of your colleagues weren't able to attend, then feel free to point them in the direction of that once that's available. I will be sending out a link to everyone who registered once the video is uploaded and ready to go. All right, so first of all, before we start with the demos and so on, just a little bit of information about myself and of course 3Grow, if you're not already familiar with us. So I'm Russ, I'm Managing Director of 3Grow. I've been a trainer for over 21 years. The last, I think that slide says 15 years. It's actually nearer 16, 17 years now, specializing in SharePoint. And also, of course, since the other apps came along, the likes of Power Apps, Power Automate, and so on. If you're not already too familiar with 3Grow, we are a Microsoft 365 specialist training organization based in Melbourne. We deliver public and private training courses in all aspects of Microsoft 365 throughout Asia Pacific. So that's anything from SharePoint, Teams, Power Apps, Power Automate, all of those. So what we're going to be covering over the next hour or so is, first of all, a little chat about folders versus columns. So a comparison of the two, just to talk about what's, pros and cons of each of those. Spoiler alert, not too many pros when it comes to folders. We'll then be introducing content types. So in my mind, content types are probably the most important aspect of SharePoint when it comes to your information architecture. So very important that we understand those and get those right. We're then going to talk about document sets. So for those of you who have attended my SharePoint Power User or Site Owner training, it is something that we get to if we have time on those courses, but often it's there's a lot to cover in that course, so often we don't get to it, which is why I know some of you are here to kind of fill in that gap of your knowledge. We'll then have a chat about managed metadata, just to introduce how that works and how that can benefit you as far as your categorization goes and so on. And we'll then have a little chat about Teams first versus SharePoint first architecture. So a lot of organizations these days are mainly focused through Teams, and that's the interface that their users actually have in front of them. However, there is a big downside to doing everything just through the standard Teams experience. So we will be talking a little bit about that as well. So first of all, the first statement I want to make is that when it comes to categorization, folders are rubbish. They are a terrible option when it comes to categorization. The reason being, they provide only a single rigid presentation of that collection of files. We also end up with this kind of compartmentalization. So all you can ever see at any given time, in the most part, unless you kind of search across folders, is the contents of a single folder at any given moment. So we don't have an easy ability to kind of look across folders. Because folders are of course, the file name must be unique within any given location. That means that, of course, it's very easy to have duplicates across those folders. People end up sometimes, if a file needs to be accessed from two separate locations, they'll end up storing the file in one place and then copying it to another folder, so we get that duplication. And of course, in that instance, very easy for those to become inconsistent and one or even both being out of date. The other issue we have with folders is that unnecessarily lengthens the URL. So the character limit of a URL within SharePoint, as far as kind of hyperlinks go, used to be 255 characters. It has now gone up to 400 characters. Now you may be thinking that's plenty. When would we ever exceed that 400 character limit? You would be surprised how easy that is, especially considering that any special characters that therefore are deemed illegal characters within a URL, such as spaces and other kind of punctuation characters, each of those will be replaced by a 3-digit what's called Unicode. So you may have spotted this within URLs before, where each space is replaced by %20. So it's quite easy to have 20 spaces or 30 spaces within the pieces of text that therefore contribute to a URL. That's things like file names, folder names, library names. 30 spaces equates to 90 characters. So each space replaced by that 3-digit Unicode. Therefore, 90 of your 400 character limit is therefore being taken up by the spaces that shouldn't have been there in the first place. So you might think that 400 characters is a lot, but yeah, if you have a few folder layers, and especially long folder names and file names, that can very easily add up to more than 400. All right, so let's have a look at an example of folders. So for those of you who are already in the same boat as me, in the sense that a folder structure is horribly inefficient and a nasty way to be organizing your files, this next slide might hurt your eyes and your heart a little bit. So prepare yourselves. Ew. So within here, we have an example, the example I'm going to be using throughout the demonstrations, which is meeting documents. So when we talk about meeting documents, we're talking about agendas and minutes in the most part. Each of those documents is related to, of course, a meeting that took place on a particular date. Maybe it's a particular type of meeting, such as team meeting, project meeting, or management meeting. Each of those will have a particular chairperson and so on. Now, there's so many different ways we could potentially arrange those files. What I've gone for in this instance is the first layer of folders is the type of meeting. We could just as easily have had the first layer of folders as being the year, then the months within those, and then maybe the type of meeting within those. So the problem is with folders, we have to choose one. We have to pick just one kind of hierarchical structure, one presentation of those files. Which of course means if we want to see anything other than documents relating to management meetings that took place in April of 2023, then very simply, we can't. The only thing we can do is essentially browse through each of the individual folders to manually extract those files. So let's have a look at an example of that horrible folder structure within one of my demo libraries. So within this site here, I've got simply called training. What we have is the out-of-the-box documents library that, of course, comes with every site, be it a team site or communication site. Now, this is a group-connected SharePoint site, and there is a Teams experience associated with this as well. So these folders that we see here are actually associated with channels within that team. So if we were to access that through Teams, of course, we would see, let's just bring that up as well. And this is something that we were going to allude to later anyway, but while we're on the subject, you'll see here I've got my training team. Within there I have my meetings channel, on which of course there is that files tab that comes with every channel. Now, within there, you'll see there is a folder per year. So the assumption here and the reason for these folders is because this is an example of that kind of Teams first approach. If people are only ever using the files tab of the appropriate channel, all they're really seeing is that kind of folder centric approach. So for example, within the 2023 folder, we have a folder per month. Within the July folder, we then have a folder per meeting type. Within the meeting type folder, we then have folders per week. If I step out and go back to the year folder, within the August folder, it's not meeting type then week, it's week then meeting type. So it's quite easy to have that inconsistency as far as the categorization goes. If I just jump into one of these folders that does contain some files, you'll see we've got this kind of quite a long naming convention in order to allow people to at least identify those files when accessing each of those folders. Quite common to have the year, month, day at the start of those file names. So at least there's one thing that we can sort by. However, that sorting will only work if people have used year as a 4-digit, so 4 digits for the year, dot 2 digits for month, dot 2 digits for year. Any deviation from that, and of course the sort order will no longer work. Back in the SharePoint site that is connected to that team, here we'll see that meetings folder representing the meetings channel. And again, we see that same folder structure, of course, presented through SharePoint. Now, as we said, if I wanted to find, let's say, all of the agendas for meetings where I was the chair, where the meeting took place in the last 30 days, how am I going to access those files? How am I going to find those files? Very difficult. What I need to do is go to multiple folders, and in each of those have to determine which ones are relating, which ones are agendas, which ones relate to meetings where I was the chair. How do I know that? Is it because my name or initials are in the file name, or do I have to open up each one and have a look? Am I supposed to remember, etc.? You see the problem. So folders, awful mechanism for categorization. I hope you will agree. So, and the next example, in this particular library, if I just switch back to the all documents view, what we have here is, so this library is not using content types, just to let you know that bit to begin with. So what we'll see here is I've created a choice column for the document type where it can specify whether it's an agenda or minutes. We've then got a choice column for meeting type, a person column for the chair, of course, a date column for meeting date. And we've also got the scribe column. The scribe is something that should be specific to minutes. So if you're not familiar with that term, the scribe is the person who took the minutes. So agendas should never have a scribe. Meeting minutes must always have a scribe. However, all of these are library level columns. These have been added to that library simply via the add column option, meaning that whether these columns have been created within the library, or you might be familiar with the concept of site columns that can be created within the site columns behind the scene, gallery behind the scenes, and added to the library. Either way, they're still library level columns, meaning that everything in the library must adhere to those column settings. So therefore, what do we do about the scribe? If it, we want it to be mandatory for minutes, but not there at all for agendas. However, we don't have that option with these library level columns. Therefore, you'll notice if I choose to edit the properties of this agenda, you will notice that the document type is agenda and the scribe is optional. Let's change that to minutes. The scribe is still there, the scribe is still optional. So I've had to do it this way because of the fact that they're library level columns, meaning that the user has to make the decision as to whether or not they should be populating that value for the scribe, dependent on whether it is minutes or agenda. Bit of a tip for you, try not to let users make decisions wherever possible, because more often than not, that's maybe a bit harsh, often, not necessarily more often than not, they will take the easiest possible route, which is, of course, to leave that property blank. What we should be doing as much as possible is enforcing good quality information going into our SharePoint sites in order to allow people to easily find that good quality information in the future. Anyone who's attended my SharePoint training, you'll know that I use that phrase a lot. So allowing a user to add an agenda and populate the scribe, or add a minutes document and leave the scribe blank, neither of those are examples of good quality information. What I've also done in this library is I have added templates. So I've removed, I've just hidden from the new menu the options for blank Word, blank Excel, and so on that come with a library by default. I've added my own templates for agenda and minutes. So this looks, if you are familiar with the concept of content types, this looks pretty similar in the fact that we can choose, in this instance, we're not choosing a specific content type, we're just choosing a document template. And then we've simply hidden the others, but the template that we choose doesn't determine the document type. So I can still choose to create based on the agenda document template, but then specify that it's minutes. So here's a bit of a question to all of you. Feel free to answer via the chat. You will notice, of course, with it being a webinar style, I have got all of your cameras and microphones muted. However, you can, of course, communicate via the chat. So the fact that this library was created based on the standard, what's called the blank library template, what content type do you think these documents would be based on? So I've not added any of my own content types. It's simply using the content type that comes with the standard blank library template. You might be thinking, well, it's not based on a content type because I haven't specified one. Well, everything that sits in a list or a library is based on a content type. That's just how SharePoint works. Every object that sits inside a list or a library must be based on a content type. So who knows? Who'd like to tell me via the chat what? Scott, Jamie, yeah, absolutely correct. They are based simply on the out-of-the-box document content type. Sarah's jumped in as well. Yes, well done, everyone. Gold stars all round. Well, not all round, just for you three. So these were based simply on the out-of-the-box document content type. Therefore, the only way to therefore add those columns is at the library level. All right, so there's an example of adding columns or creating columns directly within the library. And of course, we do get the benefits of those columns in this instance. Columns are a far more effective approach when it comes to categorization. So rather than squirreling everything away in those little folders, these documents are tagged with the appropriate properties via those columns. The beauty of that is that we then have the ability to use those columns for sorting, filtering, grouping, and so on. So what I'm going to do is just reopen that library just by clicking the link in the site navigation down the left, and that will therefore apply the default view. So notice that the default view is grouping by year, then month. The reason for that is because maybe that was the folder structure that we've moved away from. So a bit of a tip when it comes to user adoption is to try and mimic what the structure that we had that the users were already familiar with, in order to provide that element of familiarity that's really going to help with user adoption. If the user would normally go to the training folder, the meeting documents folder, the year folder, the month folder, we still want them following that same pattern because that's what they're familiar with. And the chances are, if that's the folder structure that people were using initially, the chances are that's because that was the most obvious or most common way people wanted to see those files. So by mimicking the folder structure hierarchy, but via grouped views, or by the default grouped view, that's going to hopefully assist with adoption in providing that element of familiarity. But instead of the user going to the training folder, the meeting documents folder, the year folder, the month folder, they're going to the training site, the meeting documents library, the year group, the month group. So still following the same words, but instead of folder, 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 it's site, library, group, group. But of course, as well as that immediate familiarity, we have the benefit of columns and views within SharePoint, which is flexibility. So for example, instead of grouping by year, then month, the user can say, well, I prefer to see them in this instance by year, then meeting type. So here we have them group by year, then type instead. Or we could say group by chair. Again, it just takes that chairperson column and groups each of those files by that. You'll notice that some of these files have been thrown in during some demos and not populated with the metadata, but in reality, of course, you would hope that those columns are all optional. Chaired by me. So this is dynamically filtering based on current user. So it's matching the chair column with whoever's logged in. So we get these nice dynamic views as well. So certainly better than folders. It's a step in the right direction. The main issue, however, that we have with this particular library is the fact that is that scribe column. We've had to leave it optional to allow the user to populate it for meeting minutes, but leave it blank for agendas. However, of course, that does mean they have the option to leave it blank for minutes and populate it for agendas, which of course is not good quality information. So let's have a talk about content types and how that can therefore resolve that issue. So I'll just bring those slides back up. Give me just a moment. In fact, what I'll just do it through my shared screen. That'll be an easier way rather than having to keep bringing that back into the Teams meeting. Just give me a moment, I'll open that up. The slideshow is just opening now. Apologies for the delay. It'll get there eventually. So PowerPoint seems to have just fallen over for a moment. Come on, PowerPoint. There we go. All right, so as far as content types go, let's talk about the benefits we therefore get with content types. So I've had a look at an example of using columns. So let's now talk about content types. So as we said, everything that sits in a list or a library within SharePoint is based on a content type. That's the way that it happens, that it must be. So a content type, think of a content type as being an object template. So we're not talking about just a document template, although that could be one of the settings we apply within a document orientated content type. Content types apply to both lists and libraries. So in the most part, a content type is the blueprint on which the items are based that defines the columns, the fields, the metadata, whatever you want to call them, that we can therefore populate regarding the items based on that content type. So think of a content type in the most part of just being a collection of columns. We can also have workflows, Power Automate workflows that run differently for different content types. So it could be a decision point within a Power Automate workflow, or maybe even using a trigger condition. We can say if someone submits a document, check the content type and therefore only run this workflow. So content type can determine columns or metadata. It can determine which workflows are used for maybe an approval process or any other process. With a document content type, a file content type for use within a library, we can also populate a document template into those settings as well. Also, we can set retention schedules, retention policies based on content types. So they define all of the characteristics of the items based on them. So in this example, we talked about in the previous demo, we talked about the fact that agendas and minutes might need slightly different columns. So for example, just realized inconsistent fonts there. That's not very good. Never mind. Sorry, it's just my OCD going off. So with the agenda, what the agenda content type is going to contain as far as its configuration goes is columns such as meeting date, meeting location, meeting type, and chairperson, all of which would be mandatory. What we'd also be able to do is add the agenda document template into there. So when people are creating a new file based on that agenda template, agenda content type, it'll be able to present them with that document template as a starting point. Now, the meeting minutes is going to be very similar, but with the addition of the scribe column. So again, all those same mandatory columns that the agenda has, plus that mandatory scribe column. And of course, the template would be the meeting minutes template, of course, as opposed to the agenda template. So that's the requirements that we need, and therefore content types, of course, are the solution. Because what we get with content types is that, as we said before, any columns added at the library level, or of course the same scenario goes for lists, everything in that list or library must therefore adhere to those column settings. So every item in that list will have all of those columns. We therefore have to make them optional in order to allow people to leave them blank, but of course they could still populate them and so on, as we've already discussed. Another option people go for is to, if they're not aware of content types, not familiar with how content types work, what they may do is create separate libraries, one for agendas and one for minutes, because then the library level columns can be specific to that particular type of content. The downside to that is that if I want to see all meeting documents, both agendas and minutes that match certain criteria, I can't. I've always got to look in two separate places. I can't see them all together in one location. As we said, we can also, utilize workflows for different content types. So again, it's far easier to manage that side of things. So, of course, content types are the answer. There are two key benefits to content types. The first is that they allow us to have different, albeit similar, types of item in the same list or library. So one library within which we can store both agendas and minutes. And of course, the content type we select when either creating or uploading a file within that library is what determines which columns can or must be populated. On the flip side of that, the benefit of content types is the ability to have the same type of item in multiple lists or libraries. For example, each team or department within your organization is likely to need to store meeting agendas and meeting minutes. So rather than each of those teams having to set up each of those libraries individually with library level columns and things like that, and therefore there being inconsistency across those, they may choose to create their own meeting agenda and meeting minutes content types. Again, there is still likely to be that risk of inconsistency there. So the meeting agenda and meeting minutes content types created within the sales team may be different from those created by people in HR. So what we then have the ability to do is create organization level content types. So this is done via what's called the content type hub. So many people are not aware of this, but the content type hub, i.e. organization level content types, were traditionally created within a site collection that it was pre-created within your Microsoft 365 SharePoint tenant, whose URL would simply be the tenant address /sites/content type hub. Most people these days will access that content type hub, or well, at least the organization level content types through the admin center. So for example, if I just demonstrate that here within the 3Grow environment, if I jump into the admin center, then from the Microsoft 365 admin center, specifically into the SharePoint admin center. Those of you who have tenant admin permissions within your organization may be familiar with these options here under content services, content type gallery. So any content types created through this gallery are therefore able to be published out to every site within the your SharePoint tenant. Now, unfortunately, it's not yet possible to publish content types from the organization level to only certain sites. For those of you who are familiar with old school SharePoint, where we had a kind of that concept of sub-sites, let's say the sales department would be able to create a content type via their top level sites, and that would be available for all of the sub-sites, such as the regional sales team sites. Or you could create one in finance that would be available to sub-sites such as accounts receivable, accounts payable, and payroll. We've managed to mimic, or SharePoint and Microsoft have managed to mimic some of the kind of hierarchical functionality that we used to get with old school SharePoint through hub sites, such as consistent navigation. and search scopes and roll-up scopes. However, what they haven't yet mimicked, whether they will or not in the future, I'm not sure, but what they haven't yet mimicked is the ability to publish a content type to a hub site or create a content type in a hub site, which will then pass on to the sites connected to that hub. So for example, if we've got 4 finance related sites, we've got finance, which is the hub, we've then got accounts receivable, accounts payable and payroll connected to it. I can't publish a content type just to those 4 finance sites. I'd have to either create that content type in each of those 4 sites individually as a finance person, as a finance site owner, or I would have to have those created via the organization level content type gallery and published out not only to finance, but to every single site. So there is another limitation of these organization level content types. So feel free to answer in the chat. Who are the only people that are able to create organization level content types through that organization level content type gallery? So who are the only people that can actually, yeah, the SharePoint admins. Thanks, Jamie. So the SharePoint admins, so those IT, that's like an IT role. But who should be responsible for creating finance related content types? Feel free to answer in the chat. Finance people, that's the one. Thank you, Ken. Oh, sorry, Kenny. So yeah, the site owner of the finance team site. So the someone from finance. Site owners should always be business users because they know their team, they know their content, they know how it needs to be structured, who needs what access, and so on. So therefore, the problem is that in order to have content types, created at the organization level and published out, one limitation is they can only be published everywhere, not to just certain sites. The other downside is that by default, only those people with with tenant level SharePoint admin permissions are actually able to access that content type gallery. Or can they? So, as I mentioned in the slide a moment ago, what we're actually accessing through the admin center is actually just the content type gallery of the site called Content Type Hub. So if I just jump back into the training environment here, and let's just open up any old SharePoint site, or just SharePoint Home will do. What I'm then going to do is just manually enter the URL of that, which is simply tenant URL /sites /content type hub. I can simply type that into the address bar. I've actually already got that favorited, so I can actually click straight into that. So this is just it's a team site. Not that it matters what type of site it is, but it's actually in here, which is where those organization level content types are created and managed. So although non-IT people cannot get to the content type gallery through the admin center, they can be given permission to the content type hub SharePoint site. So for example, in this other browser tab here, I'm signed in as one of the student accounts I use on the training courses, which is student 02. They are not an IT admin. Notice therefore they don't see the admin center at all within their app launcher. However, what I can then do is grant them permissions to the content type hub. So into the site permissions, and this may be a little bit messy from previous demonstrations on previous training courses. All I'm going to do here is simply add student 02 as an owner within the content type hub. They'll then receive an email invitation. Now let's jump into student 02's inbox. Or of course, probably a quicker way, all they'll do is just go back to the, grab the URL of the content type hub. jump back in as student 02, open up a new tab, paste. What I've also done is just added shortcuts to the site navigation, which jumps straight into the content types gallery and the columns gallery within the content type hub, rather than having just to go into the site settings every single time. So here in the content types gallery, a non-IT person, i.e. student 2, is able to create and publish content types to the whole organization. Now, of course, we shouldn't be dishing out those permissions to everyone in the organization. Select site owners who have had an appropriate level of training and have therefore can be trusted, can therefore be given permissions to that content type hub. Right, so nice little trick for you, allowing business users to create and publish content types to the whole organization. All right, so back to the slides for a moment. Let's just make sure we cover everything on content types before we go on. Yep, okay, so let's now see an example of content types. For this demonstration, I am just going to be doing this within the at the site level as opposed to at the organization level. I'm just going to show you the content types I already have set up. So you'll notice I've got meeting documents, then meeting documents with a full stop on the end. Both look very similar. So when we go to the new button, we see agenda and minutes. We have the views that apply grouping because we have the columns that provide the categorization. However, the main difference you'll see here is that agenda or minutes is specified via, as a content type, not as just a choice column called document type, which we had in the previous library. The beauty of this, therefore, is notice if I choose to edit the properties of the agenda, there is no such thing as a scribe. Or the agenda related columns would therefore be mandatory. So you'll see, for example, meeting type, meeting date, meeting location, chair, participants, and so on are all mandatory. There is no scribe. If I were to say that's not an agenda, that's minutes, let's have a look at what happens to the columns. We now see the scribe and it's mandatory. So the content type is determining which columns can or must be populated. I've also incorporated document templates into those content types. What I've also done is an extra clever little step, which I'm probably not going to demonstrate this bit during the webinar because I do have a video on the 3Grow YouTube channel that takes you through this process. I will publish the slides to each of you as well, and there are a list of links and resources at the end of that slide deck where you'll be able to easily access those videos from YouTube. But what you'll notice here is when we choose to create, well, let's just demonstrate this within the previous library. We choose to create an agenda, and it simply presents us with the agenda document template. What the user would then do is simply fill in the appropriate fields. It would look a bit prettier in the desktop version. You may be aware that the browser-based version of Word doesn't tend to show kind of background images or header and footer images. So it does look a bit plain and boring here, but it would look much better in the desktop version of Word. So the user is entering this information into the surface of the document. They then save it. I won't bother filling it in here. We know how to type into a document. Once I close that, I would then need to go and fill in the properties of that document as an additional step. So there's that new file. I would then need to go and edit those properties. Now I created this based on the agenda document template, but I can just as easily say it's minutes. Whether I choose minutes or agenda, I can still choose whether to populate the scribe or not. So that's those issues that we see with content types. Sorry, without content types. So let's now do that same demonstration here within this meeting documents library. Well, I'll show you the setup of this behind the scenes in a few moments. First of all, we're just seeing how we would interact with this library from an end user perspective. So now in this next library, when I choose to create an agenda, what you'll notice is not only does it present me with the agenda document template, but what we have embedded in that template are the SharePoint columns, the fields associated with the agenda content type. One slight limitation here is that we cannot populate those on the surface of the document within the browser-based version of Word. Whether that's something Microsoft are going to change at some point in the future, I'm not sure. But for now, all we do is just jump into the desktop version of Word. And what we're actually seeing, as we said, embedded in that document are the SharePoint properties that have been identified by the content type. So in here, it looks like it's opened a cached version of that file. So it is pre-populated for some strange reason. I have noticed it doing that a couple of times recently. Let's just try reopening the document. Second time around is normally fine. So what some people may think is, oh, it's done the same thing. Never mind. All right, let's just populate the information in here. And as you'll see, when we've got those same kind of options we have as we would when populating through SharePoint. So I can choose that it's a team meeting, meeting date and location and so on. You'll notice the person column, the field we embed on the Word document doesn't have the ability to validate our users. So what we could therefore do instead is we can still populate that information through Word just via the SharePoint properties pane. Not all of the fields have been embedded on the surface of the document template, but certainly some of those have, and you'll notice those will be populated in this right-hand pane once that opens up. Some people think that what's happening here is that we're filling in information inside the document that it's then copying into the SharePoint properties, or that it's kind of syncing to the SharePoint properties. It's not. What we're seeing here are the SharePoint properties. So it's not syncing them anywhere, it's not copying them anywhere. These are the SharePoint properties. I have also noticed recently that this properties pane sometimes takes an age to open. So maybe we'll have to just, in the interest of time, maybe we'll just leave that bit for now. But the general idea is we populate the fields inside the body of the document, and they are the SharePoint properties. So essentially it's categorizing whilst simply filling in those properties. Okay, it looks like it's trying to load now. There we go. All right, so here I can then add the chairperson. I can then add meeting participants. Now, another slight limitation, meeting participants is a multi-person, multi-select person or group column. We can't actually present those on the surface of the document. So what you will see if you visit that video on the YouTube channel is that in the template, we embed these fields by going to Insert, Quick Parts, Document Properties. In here, we have standard Office file properties that every Office document will come with, but mixed in with those, we also have the SharePoint properties that are defined by the content type on which this file is based. What you will notice is that there is no meeting participants column available, so we cannot embed that in there. There are little workarounds we could potentially use using Power Automate or something like that. All right, either way, I've populated those properties. We'll just save and close. Back in the library, you'll see those changes reflected. So back in the browser-based version of Word, we'll close that dialog box. It'll refresh and those changes are reflected. Ordinarily, of course, we then give it a somewhat meaningful file name. Of course, we don't need to go overboard with that file naming convention because the name is no longer the only piece of information we have to go by to identify that file. Instead, of course, I won't bother with the file name in this instance. Of course, we have I'm not sure what I even called the file. Maybe I should refresh the page. Should have, I think I put today's date. Yep, so we now have the February group, and there we have that file. So we don't need the file name to be hugely descriptive because, of course, that's what those columns are for. Now, I'll briefly just show you how that's set up behind the scenes. So I'll jump into the site information, into view all site settings to then jump into the document, the content types gallery. So the way that I've structured these is meeting documents. I've only got two examples of meeting document content types at the moment, agenda and minutes. However, we may have more in the future. So what I've done is I've created a content type. In fact, I do have a meeting paper and in there as well. So what I've done is I've created this meeting document content type to which I've added any columns that that are common amongst any meeting document, whether it's agenda, paper, minutes, and so on. You'll notice I've got a couple of calculated columns. So here I've got meeting year and meeting month. We don't want the user having to enter a date and then enter the year and month for categorization purposes. So I've created calculated columns to perform those actions. So the user enters the meeting date, it automatically calculates the year and month. Just in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through those calculations right now, but if they are something you're interested in seeing how I've done that, feel free to reach out, or maybe we can talk about it within the Q&A at the end. So I've got the meeting document content type. The meeting document content type must be somewhere below the out-of-the-box document content type in order to allow us to use those within a library. I've then added agenda, minutes, and paper, and you'll see that their parent is meeting document, meaning that each of those will inherit the columns from meeting document. I don't need to add those columns every time. If you find yourself, creating meeting agenda, meeting minutes, meeting paper, adding most of the same columns to each of those, that's of course not a very efficient way of doing things. A phrase I like to use is if you find yourself repeating the same actions over and over again, there's probably a better way of doing it. The better way of doing it, of course, in this instance, is to create that meeting document content type, add any common meeting related columns to that, and then any content type below that will inherit those columns. All I then need to do is add anything that is unique to that particular content type, such as in the meeting minutes, I've also added scribe, and it is mandatory. So it's mandatory for minutes, not there at all for any others. All right, so just a quick overview of how I created those meeting and how I structured those meeting document content types. So there we see a nice example of those benefits of content types. So let's now move on to document sets. So document sets can often be described as folders on steroids. So they still have those the benefit of folders as far as permissions management goes. So I did say earlier that folders are terrible when it comes to categorization. However, they are very good when it comes to managing permissions on a subset of items. For example, here within this meeting documents library that uses the content types, I want all of my meeting documents in one place, even though some of those may be relating to management meetings, therefore should only be visible to managers. So in order to control those permissions, I certainly don't want to be managing permissions on each of those management meeting documents individually. So you'll notice I've got a view here that is called folders, and this view is only visible to me as the site owner. And notice here I have this management meetings folder. The permissions of this folder have been modified so that the only people that have access to that are the site owners, which in the case of this example are who we are assuming are the managers. What you may notice is that when we go to this view that, for example, groups by chair, the contents of the folder are mixed in here with what's in the root of the library. So we get the benefit of folders in the sense that we can manage permissions on a group of items in one go, because again, if we're setting permissions on each document individually to be the same as each other, then we're repeating the actions, we're repeating ourselves, therefore better way of doing it. So by putting those management meeting documents in the folder and then locking down the permissions of that folder, that means that of course only managers can see them, but within these grouped views, or in fact any other view, I've asked this view not to show folders, i.e. strip away the folder structure visually. If you're not familiar with this option, you absolutely should be. We can access it through the classic view editing experience. So we just apply that view, choose edit current view. Now down here, there's this folders option. You'll see the option here, show all items without folders. So all of the views other than the view called folders have this option applied, because the folders are only relevant to me as the site owner, because I'm the one who decides who should see which files need to be in that folder and therefore locked down only to managers. The result of that is if I were to open up that library as the student 2 account, student 2 can still apply the same views with the same groupings. The difference is, let's just apply, for example, grouped by chair. Let's have a look at the numbers next to each of these. You'll notice the numbers are 2782 as far as number of files in each of those are concerned. Let's apply, oops, that's applied the classic view for some reason for a moment. Let's then go to back to that same library and apply the same view as me. And you'll see that those numbers will be different because I'm also seeing the contents of that meeting documents folder. So my numbers are 57112 compared to 2782. So you'll see they don't see meeting documents, management meeting documents, sorry, whereas I do. So folders are great for managing permissions. Documents, or document sets, should I say, have the same functionality. So we can set permissions at a document set level, same as we can with a folder, and therefore those permissions will be applied to everything inside it. Folders, document sets give us that single layer of categorization, which is therefore beneficial when syncing that library to File Explorer. One of the downsides to using solely columns as a means of categorization is that as soon as we open that library within File Explorer, having synced that, we're no longer seeing any form of categorization. So here, for example, meeting documents, all we're seeing is any folders that may be there for permissions management reasons. The rest of them, we're just going to have a big long list of documents. That's a bit frustrating. Whereas with document sets, a document set presents as a folder. And therefore, what we're seeing in File Explorer are folders, but technically speaking, within SharePoint, they're actually document sets. So handy for that purpose as well. With a document set, what also sets document sets apart from folders is the ability to add columns or fields or properties or metadata, whatever you want to call them, to the document set itself. We can then share those properties with the contents, meaning that we don't have to populate the properties per document. By simply being in that document set, it will inherit those properties. We can also specify what document content types we want to allow inside a document set. So, for example, within the meeting meeting document set content type I've got set up, I've said I only want to allow meeting document, meeting agenda, meeting minutes, and meeting paper. And the final benefit of content types is the ability to add or to specify default, what it calls default content. What that means is every time I create a new document set, it can come pre-populated with some standard files. The example being, every meeting must have an agenda and a minutes. Rather than the user having to create those manually, they can be pre-created every time someone creates a meeting. There are some gotchas and limitations when it comes to document sets. First of all, the feature must be activated. This is a site collection feature. So if you choose to create a content type and you don't see the option to create a document set content type, that's because the feature has not been activated. I'll show you where that feature is in just a moment. There is currently no modern experience. So when we're creating a document set, it will give us a classic form, classic SharePoint, if you're familiar with the difference. And again, we'll see that in a moment. We can use a modern form. However, we have to manually create that modern form by using the Power Apps Forms customization within the library. We then have to use a Power Automate workflow on the Save button or Submit button of that modern form because, again, the modern form doesn't have the ability to create it. Luckily, there is now, whereas there wasn't up until quite recently, a create document set action within Power Automate. We used to have to use an HTTP request action for that. There is now an out of the box create document set action within Power Automate. So of course, we're not going to have time to go into those, but it's just things I wanted to point out. All right, so let's have a look at a document set in action. So here within And then we'll have a look at the configuration behind the scenes. So within this library simply called meetings, here we have our document sets. They're based on a content type I created called meeting. They have columns again, such as meeting date, meeting type, and so on. Let's have a look at creating first of all. So I'm going to choose to create a meeting. As we said, it will offer us only a classic experience by default. If you wanted to change that, then we can, as we said, do that through Power Automate. So let's just say team meeting. So give it a unique name, followed by the date. We can then specify meeting date, defaults to today, meeting type, team meeting, meeting location. This is managed metadata. Judging by the time, we're not going to have time to go into managed metadata in a lot of detail, if at all. But the idea of managed metadata is a hierarchical structure of terms that we can build behind the scenes. So notice here, if I choose to, rather than typing, I can select a tag term. So this is a hierarchical structure I've built through what's called the term store behind the scenes of the site. And you'll notice I can browse through that structure and choose the appropriate tag. And therefore, by tagging it with Thornbury, what it's actually doing is also tagging it with Melbourne, Vic, and Australia, all in one go. So nice means of providing those properties. Chair, I'll just add myself as the chair, and myself and Anya as the attendee, the meeting participants. There we go. And save. So fill in the information. Now watch the magic happen. So I've configured this so that it pre-creates, using that default content option, an agenda and a minutes document within each new meeting document set. So notice I've already got a meeting agenda and a meeting minutes. Also notice their properties. So it's inherited those properties from the document set itself. Now, as you'll no doubt be aware, if we select a file, open up the details pane, here we are able to view and edit the properties of that. Inside a document set with nothing selected, the properties I'm therefore seeing are that of the document set. So if I were to change that from team meeting to management meeting, keep your eye on the meeting type column against the documents, and it updates. If I tried to edit that any of these properties at the document level, it will simply ignore me. It won't allow me to do that. Now with the agenda, the template I've used when telling it to pre-create content is the template that has the quick parts already embedded. So let's see what happens when I then choose to open this file within the desktop version of Word. Of course, the document was based on a template with the quick parts, those SharePoint fields embedded, and the fact the file has therefore inherited those properties from the document set. It comes pre-populated. Isn't that clever? If I do say so myself. So therefore, the bulk of that the properties are done. All we do is just add the specific agenda items. Pretty cool. I mean, cool is a relative term. Cool as far as SharePoint goes. All right. Anything that is created or uploaded within here. So notice here we've got the ability to create based on only the content types that I want to allow inside a meeting, which is meeting agenda, meeting minutes, generic meeting document, or a meeting paper. Any of those, of course, we could have the templates associated with those, and they'll then inherit those properties. Same goes for if I were to upload a file. Let's just grab just a random file from my desktop, which is simply here for these demonstration purposes. I will upload that. Notice that the view applied within the document set is grouping by content type. I can actually drag and drop a file onto the appropriate content type group. So if I drag it into the minutes group, which of course it's not, it's an agenda, but it doesn't matter for the sake of the example, it will therefore assign it that content type. Now I can't move it into the, in fact, I think I can actually, I can move it into there to change the content type. Does that work these days? Yes, it does. Okay, there we go. So I can drag and drop between those groups, which actually changes the content type. Notice while if it's in the minutes, if it's based on minutes, the scribe then becomes mandatory. Now we don't actually see the scribe in here, but you will notice that the scribe column is mandatory because it's minutes, and it therefore flags that it's missing a mandatory property. Or maybe I haven't made it mandatory in this instance, but you get the idea. It would do. Okay, so either way, it is possible to populate a scribe because it's a minutes, whereas if it's an agenda, we can't. So when dragging and dropping into a library, if you drag it onto a group heading, it will actually tag it with that property or that content type, whatever that group represents. And again, it will inherit those shared columns that have been identified at the document set level. Pretty clever. All right, what we'll now do, we are about out of time. So what we'll do is have a quick look at the how that's set up behind the scenes. So first of all, into site information, view all site settings. And here within the content types gallery, that's where we could, of course, create them. But first of all, within your SharePoint sites, by default, the document set content type won't be available by default. Therefore, what we'd have to do is here go into the site collection features. You will see, of course, I have already activated that document sets feature. But what you would need to do is simply click activate to activate that. Once that's activated, back to the site settings, into the content types gallery. And when we choose to create a new content type, of course, every content type needs a parent. So when choosing to create a content type, we would choose document set content types. The fact that document set content types as a category is there is only because document set is there, which is only because that feature has been activated. So we need to base it on the document set content type. That's only there because of the feature. So if you don't see it, you need to activate the feature. Of course, I'm not going to create a new one from scratch. I've already created the meeting content type. Let's have a look at those settings. So create it based on document set. I can then assign it the appropriate columns. So I've added to the document set content type meeting. I've added meeting date, meeting type, location, chair, participants, the calculated columns for year and month, and just a checkbox column to specify whether or not catering is required. So far, you'll see this is very, very similar to creating a list item or document content type. The difference, however, is we have these additional options, document set settings. What we can then do is specify which content types, which document content types we want to allow inside this document set, i.e. inside a meeting. So I've added those 4. Here we have default content. So this is where I've actually uploaded the file that already had the quick parts. So a bit of a trick here is once, again, there's a video on YouTube that takes you through how to actually embed those quick parts in the document template. Now, the problem here is we can't browse. That has to be in a SharePoint library in order to be based on the content type, in order to add the quick parts into it, because the quick parts are columns, the columns provided by the content type. So it has to actually be, it'll all make sense if you watch the other video, but it has to be in a SharePoint library in order to, based on the content type, in order to add those quick parts into the template. However, when adding a template here, we cannot point it to a file in a SharePoint library. The trick is download it. When you download that file with the quick parts in it in SharePoint, download that to your local computer, the quick parts stay, which means I can then upload it into here and it will then automatically marry them up with the columns. That's quite clever. So I set those templates up within a SharePoint library. I then downloaded them to my local computer in order to then upload them. So that's those. Each of those, and of course we need to specify which of those document content types the pre-populated, i.e. the default content type, should be based on. Here under shared columns, we can specify which meeting columns, i.e. which document set columns we want to force on all of the files inside it. It says shared, that's a polite way of saying forced. So it's forcing those properties over all the contents. There is this welcome page option, which doesn't really do anything anymore. It used to be that in classic SharePoint libraries, there was what we call a welcome page, which is a banner across the top where we see those properties. That doesn't exist anymore, so don't worry about the welcome page bit at all. So they are the additional settings that we have within a document set that we don't have within a regular list item or document content type. So once that content type is all set up, all I did was back in the library. The first thing I would need to do if adding any custom content types to any library is jump into the library settings. This content types section of settings we see here wouldn't normally be here by default. We'd have to go to the advanced settings and choose this option to allow management of content types. Having done that, we then see the content type section, and you'll see this is the meeting documents library where I've already added the agenda and minutes document content types. Doesn't matter where I am, but for the sake of the example, just add from existing site content types, and then I would add my meeting document set content type from here. Again, I'm not going to add that in this instance. Of course, that's already been done within that meetings library. Now there is no need, in fact we don't want to add the document content types, because any content types you add at the library level will therefore present those in this drop down, whereas I don't want people creating documents in the root of the library, only inside a meeting. The document content types are already configured in the settings of the meeting document set content type. So we don't add the document content types, just the document set. And of course, as we saw within there, that's where the documents live, and that's where those document content types associated with the document set content type will then appear. All right, so there we go. An example of document sets in action. As we said, they do appear as folders through File Explorer. So here within this library where I've actually synced, that I've already synced to File Explorer, each of these folders represent a meeting document set. If I were to create or upload something into here, of course, it will inherit those properties because we're adding it straight to that document set. All right, jump back into the slides just for a moment. We've had a look at the example. So in this example, a document set per meeting, the metadata that we add at the meeting level is passed on to all the documents. We're only allowing meeting related document content types inside each meeting. And we've also had it pre-create one agenda and 1 minute per meeting. This option, this bit here, flatten library via views for cross-meeting document browsing. What we mean by that is that same option that we saw within that previous library where we can ask it to remove folders visibly within that view. That same concept applies to document sets. Document sets are treated as meetings in that context. So here I could, for example, show all meetings, which of course are the document sets. I've also got a view called all documents, which doesn't apply any filtering other than to remove the document sets themselves. It just shows all of those agendas and minutes, allowing the user to sort and filter and group those as they see fit. I've got meetings grouped by location. As you can see, within each group, we have the document sets, but we've also got, for example, documents grouped by type. So again, in this view, it's pulling everything out of the document sets, then grouping by the content type. So we don't have that limitation of folders in this instance, which is that compartmentalization. All right. Okay, so managed metadata, we talked briefly about that. Unfortunately, we don't really have time to go into that in any more detail. I would like to spend some time on Q&A. The other thing I wanted to talk about was Teams first versus SharePoint first. The idea is, in my opinion, in the most part, don't use the documents library for these kind of scenarios where you need this more comprehensive structure. Do that via new SharePoint libraries. If you then want to present those files through Teams, what we would do is here you'll see on the meetings tab, we've got the files, the meetings channel, we've got the files tab where we see that folder structure. Instead, you'll notice what I've got here is a meeting documents tab. So what I did there was I simply added a website tab. I then copied the URL of the appropriate view of my more formally structured meetings library. Just copy the URL within Teams, add the website tab, paste in the URL, and what you'll now see is we're actually getting, I think this was the meeting. Yeah, this is not the one with the document sets. Doesn't matter which one. We just add a website tab. Oh, sorry, it is. I'm lying. So here we've got the full SharePoint experience with document sets, metadata, views available through Teams. So don't just chuck everything in the Files tab, create your libraries through SharePoint. So that's SharePoint-first information architecture, and then surface that via the team as additional tabs. All right. As we said, here are those links and resources, a few little videos that you may want to check on. But as far as demos and slides go, we're done. All right, so I'm not sure if anything had popped up in the Q&A. I wasn't keeping an eye on that during the demos, but we can have a look at that now. All right, a couple of questions there. So, Alex, do we need to enable the document set feature within each site or team we want to use, or just the content type hub? So, if you were to create a document set content type in the hub, in the content type hub, and then try publishing that content type, it will not be present within the sites where that content type, where that document sets feature has not been activated. So annoyingly, yes, you do need to activate that feature per site, technically per site collection, but of course that flatter structure that we go for these days dictates that we really only have one site per site collection rather than that sub-site scenario we used to use. But yes, it is a per site collection feature that needs to be activated. Publishing a document set content type from the hub to all sites isn't going to activate that feature for you. I'm sorry, that's not the answer you're looking for probably, but unfortunately it is the correct answer. So Jeremy, how does the manager save their documents into the management folder if they cannot see the management folder? So in that instance, they can see the folder. What I would do is in that scenario where, so just to recap on what we talked about, what I did was I created that a personal view called folders, because I don't want other people knowing those folders exist. If that was the case, I mean, managers are the only ones that would see the folder anyway. In this instance, I wanted it so that I was the only one that could see the folders. But in reality, I'd make that a public view, because if that's a public view, you're still only going to see the folder if you're a manager. So it's not going to affect other people anyway. So in this instance, it's a personal view. In reality, just make it a public view. Does that make sense, Jeremy? Does that answer your question? Give me a yes or no in the chat or in the Q&A. Yep. Okay, perfect. All right. So what I'm now going to do is, does anybody have any other questions other than those that were posted through the Q&A system? If so, please raise your hand. What I'm going to do is, I think I should be able to change the meeting settings to allow you to unmute. You can ask a question verbally if you didn't want to do that via the Q&A. So does anybody have any other questions? Please raise your hand if so, and I can then get to you in turn. Oh, there's one. Yeah, I was just about to give up on that. Steve, there we go. So Steve, you are now able to unmute your microphone. I have now enabled that setting.
Thanks, Russ. I was just wondering, to access the slides and recording, how do we get to them after the presentation?
I'll just be sending out an email, or in fact, what I'll probably do is actually, I'll just put it on the 3Grow blog. So on the 3Grow website, there's a blog on there. So I'll once the video is uploaded to YouTube, I'll embed that video in there, but also put a link to the slides within that blog post as well. Once that blog post is published, I'll then just send a link out to all of the attendees.
Amazing, thank you so much.
All right, no problem. So does anybody else have any other questions relating to anything we've talked about over the last, or indeed anything we haven't talked about in the last hour or hour and 15? That did run over a little bit, didn't it? Before we wrap up. No. All right. In which case, what I will be doing is just adding a link into the chat. The chat will still be live after the meeting has finished, so feel free to jump in there, jump back into the chat and post any other additional questions if anything crops up afterwards. What I'm popping up into the chat now is a link to the webinar feedback. If you would like to provide your feedback on that session, that would be wonderful. I have recently realized that we have very little in the way of, why is that link not pasting? Give me a second, copy link. I've just realized recently we don't have very much in the way of Facebook or Google reviews. So what I'm also going to do is just drop the link to the 3Grow Facebook and Google pages. So if you'd like to provide feedback that way, that would be wonderful. It seems quite important these days for people to have those Facebook and Google reviews. However, I've never pushed it and we don't have much of it. So I thought I'd take this opportunity, see if I can get some get those reviews up to a little bit. So I'll drop those into the chat shortly as well. And the feedback form link is already there. All right. So thank you all so much for your time. Keep an eye out for that email regarding the video and the slides and so on. And feel free to get in touch if you have any questions, queries, comments, problems, anything like that in the future, or if there's anything else we can do to help. If you want to talk about upskilling in any of those Microsoft 365 apps, then feel free to get in touch. All right. Thanks a lot for your time, everyone. Thanks for joining. Take care.
Thanks, Russ.
No problem. Thanks a lot.